Hello once again, my name is Adam St. John. I'm a fire protection engineer with the ATF Fire Research Laboratory, and this is the third part of the video series. And in the first two parts, we talked about ventilation flow paths. We told you guys how they form, why they're killing us firefighters, and even some tactical considerations, trying to isolate ourselves from these flow paths. We also talked a little bit about basement fires. But today, in this third part of the video series, we're going to focus on two topics that are very popular in the fire ground right now. Ventilation, the effects of ventilation, why the more we vent right now in the modern fire environment with modern fuels, the hotter the environment gets, the more the fire grows. So venting no longer equals cooling, and we'll go over why as part of today's lesson. We'll talk a little bit about our fuels, how they've changed over the past 20, 30, 40 years, and also some tactics. That's what everybody wants to know, right? When do we ventilate? How do we ventilate? What are the effects of different ventilation methods, as well as suppression? We're going to talk a little bit today about fire attack, both interior attack and exterior attack. And we'll look at a few studies done by both UL and NIST, a lot of actual fire tests that have been done by us at ATF, and even some actual fire ground video to illustrate these tactics. It's not going to be me talking about them. We're going to show lots of videos. And we'll wrap the whole lesson up with an actual scale fire model. It's great to learn with graphs and with actual fire models, computer models, but we all, as firefighters, we all learn seeing actual fire videos. And that's what the foundation of this lesson is going to be based on. So what are we talking about? When we look at ventilation, this is something that has often been misunderstood by the fire service. And even ventilation limited fires, which by the way, are the majority of the fires we run, us as investigators don't fully understand them or haven't fully understood them until recently. So what do we mean when we say ventilation limited fire? Us as engineers are great at coming up with these technical terms, but this is something that you as firefighters see every single day. So when we say ventilation limited fire, we're talking about the fire triangle, this thing that we all learn about in elementary school. Every fire needs to have these three aspects: fuel, heat, and air. We all understand that. But we're just starting to understand now is that the limiting factor to the size of the fire, the energy released by the fire, in almost every single fire that we run as a fire department, is the air. The air is the limiting factor. The ventilation is the factor that limits the fire growth. When that smoke layer is flown from the floor to ceiling, which is what we see in almost every fire, when we pop that front door in order to bring a hand line into that house, in order to do a search, we're allowing air to enter that structure. What also do we see in most of these cases? We see, well, almost nothing. We see a lot of smoke. We see zero visibility. We see that smoke layer from floor to ceiling. What does that mean? The same reason that that lack of oxygen kills victims or us inside of a fire if we don't have air on is the same reason that fire goes out. Oxygen is missing. And when we ventilate, we're giving a ventilation limited fire more air. And that fire is going to grow every single time unless we put water on it. We're going to talk a lot about coordinating ventilation, and I promise at the end of today we're going to understand what that truly means. We have a certain grace period by the time we arrive on scene, when we ventilate, and when that fire is going to respond to that air. We'll go over that grace period. How long do we have? And if we don't put water on that fire during that grace period, what's going to happen? We need to expect that rapid fire growth. So the key of today is we must control the ventilation until we're ready to put water on the fire. And yes, that even means the front door. We're going to talk a lot about ventilation and a lot about tactics. We need to ventilate every single fire for two key reasons. The first reason being, we're not going to be able to enter a structure unless we ventilate. When we open that front door, we're going to ventilate. So we're saying we have to ventilate every fire. We have to ventilate every fire. We just have to coordinate that ventilation with the fire attack. We limit the amount of ventilation until we put water on the fire. And once we have water on that fire, the more we ventilate, the quicker, the faster the conditions will improve for firefighters inside and for victims. So we're certainly not saying, based on all of the research done by these three agencies, don't ventilate fires. We need to control that ventilation, and once water is put on that fire, the more we ventilate, the better things are going to get. That smoke's going to leave, the temperature is going to drop, and the conditions are going to get more tenable for everybody in that fire. So these are the heat release rate curves, and what we're talking about, this is one of what we call a fuel limited fire. This rarely happens inside of a structure, inside of a compartment. Think of this as a couch outside, like we see here in a parking lot. The couch will catch fire, the flames will spread along that couch is fully involved, it has plenty of air the entire time, and eventually it runs out of fuel. You take that exact same couch and you put it inside of a room. You light the couch on fire, the fire throughout time, the fire will spread across that couch. The amount of energy released, the heat release rate, the size of the fire will increase until that fire begins to die down. Once that smoke layer drops below level of flames, the fire begins to go out. It goes out until we come there as a fire department, until we ventilate. And then once we ventilate, the fire grows. It has plenty of fuel, it has plenty of heat, and we give it the needed air. So what does this look like in real life? This is a simple compartment, and we're going to start with just a single room that's on fire, and we'll expand on that and go to an actual structure on fire. So what are we looking at here? Well, we see this is a room that was built in our laboratory. It's actually built for a homicide case that we worked. And we wanted to see how long it took this fire to grow and what the timeline was for a suspect that we had. So this room is closed. The doorway to the room is shut, and we light a fire. This is that slow growth phase of that fire. The fire is growing relatively slowly. As that flame spreads across our fuel, it's going to give off more energy, which is going to release more fuel. It's going to heat the fuel up faster, and the flames are going to spread even quicker. So at this point in time, this fire is not ventilation limited. How many fires do we run where we have plenty of visibility, no smoke, and just a little bit of fire? Not very many. The majority of fires that we run, there's zero visibility, it's ventilation limited, and we have a relatively large volume of fire somewhere in that structure. So we're going to watch this fire. As I accelerate this video, it's going to transition. That smoke layer is going to rise, and it's going to drop below the flames, and these flames are going to essentially go out until we ventilate the structure. I know this is very simple, but this is what we're talking about. We're going to start basic. We're going to move and watch what happens when we ventilate an entire structure without putting water on it. So this fire continues to grow. This is that slow growth phase. And as the fire continues to spread, it gives off more energy, it gives off more smoke. And if there was ventilation, eventually this will go through flashover because there's ventilation, because there's fuel, because there's heat. In this case, we have fuel. We have plenty of in this case, the mattress is there. We have plenty of heat, but we're limiting the ventilation. That hollow core door is shut. So when that ventilation is limited, that smoke layer drops below the level of the flames, and that fire begins to actually go out. In this case, the suspect he killed his girlfriend. The girlfriend was in between the two mattresses. He wanted to cover up the crime. But when he shut the door, that fire ended up going out. We've had cases with ATF where a Christmas tree has caught fire inside of a house. It was away from windows. When the occupant left, they shut the door. By the time the fire department arrived, they opened the door, and the fire put itself out. It had no air. The majority of fires we run are ventilation limited. We look at this video again, we can see the fire starting to die down. This looks very different from when we started the video. When we started it, we had good visibility, a little bit of fire. Now we have very poor visibility. We have a ventilation limited condition. The fire is starting to go out. Plenty of heat, plenty of fuel, no air. I think you guys get the point. So as we accelerate this, we can see that there's only a really small fire existing in the mattress over here with a thermal imaging camera. And in fact, there's a little bit of smoke coming out, not a whole lot of smoke. This is a working fire. If we ventilate, it will certainly go through flashover. But when you arrive on scene and you just see a little bit of smoke or even no smoke, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no fire inside. This fire, the only thing it's missing is the oxygen. So I'm going to fast forward this a little bit farther, and we're actually going to see for 15 minutes it goes almost dormant. It's waiting for the air. So when we open that door, we think we're going to improve conditions. We think we're letting the hot air out. We think we're letting cold air in. We think we're going to improve visibility. But in actuality, that fire is responding to the added air. It's growing, and the byproducts released by the fire overcome that vent. The conditions do not improve. And this happens in every single fire that is ventilation limited if we do not put water on it. I think you guys get that. So let's go back and let's look at some other actual incidents. This is a heat release rate curve, the fire size curve from Cherry Road. Now, when they arrived on scene, the fire was in its ventilation limited state. So the fire is growing in that basement. and it begins to run out of air. Now the fire size is relatively small. The factor limiting the fire is the air. Until, in this case, the fire department arrives. When they break out that first slider, that is when that fire begins to grow again. You're not letting the heat out. You're not improving visibility because that fire is responding to the air in almost every fire we run. Now, if you notice, the fire doesn't instantly go up to its maximum size. There's a temporary spike, and then there's another spike after that. What is happening? Well, in this case, they open one half of the slider and then the other half. So the fire will respond proportionately to how much ventilation you give it. What does that mean? It means if you arrive on scene, you force that front door and just the front door is open, it's going to respond slower than if you open the front door and break out the front plate glass window and you break out every window upstairs. So it responds proportionally to the amount of ventilation you have. So if you break out every single window, and especially if those ventilation openings are close to that fire is going to grow a lot faster. What does that mean also? It means if you pop that front door and close it, now the door is open, it's available for that engine crew to make entry, but if they're not ready yet, close that door. And if you close that door and limit the opening, that fire is going to grow even slower. Back to Cherry Road. The fire grows, it runs out of air, begins to die down. They break one slider, it grows. As soon as they break that second slider, it takes off. They think they're letting more air in, they think they're allowing for easier search conditions, and that's not the reality. The fire responds to that air. So what has changed through the years? We used to teach we're going to vent for life, we're going to vent for fire, we're going to let that heat out, we're going to improve conditions. Our fuels respond to the ventilation that we have. They release more energy faster than ever before. How much faster? Well, these are the tests that were done by UL. Many people have seen these. I'm not going to show these. They're available on UL's website, but they compared what they call legacy furniture to modern furniture. Our furniture nowadays contains lots of synthetic materials versus lots of natural materials. So back in the day, they had cotton batting, they had cotton material, sometimes they even had wool. They actually made out of true dimensional lumber. Now there's a lot of plastic materials, lots of foams, polyurethane foams that are they're lightweight, they're synthetic, they're more plastic-based, and they release energy faster. Do they burn any hotter? No. But they do respond to the ventilation we give them faster. They release that energy faster than ever before. How much faster? Well, looking at these tests that UL did, almost 10 times faster. The modern room with the same weight of furniture goes to flashover in about 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The exact same room, the same ventilation conditions, took almost 30 minutes to go to flashover for the furniture, the legacy furniture, the older furniture. So our fuels have changed. Our fire environment has changed. The more you ventilate, the hotter that environment is going to get. But you do have a grace period in that time. The general rule, and we'll talk about this a lot more a little bit later, is to put water on the flames as soon as possible, from the inside or from the outside. I know that's new to some people as well. We'll talk about this. So the universal rules of ventilation, what are we going to talk about now? Well, it doesn't matter whether it's horizontal ventilation or vertical ventilation, or if we start a fan at the front door. If a fire is ventilation limited, the more we ventilate, the faster that fire is going to respond, the more energy it's going to release. We are not saying don't ventilate a structure. Ventilation must be done. It can certainly improve conditions, but it's got to be coordinated. It will improve conditions if you have a means of absorbing that energy. Back to that fire triangle. We're always going to have that fuel, but if we take away that heat, then we're going to actually put out that fire. We're always going to have that fuel, but if we take away the air, then that fire will go out. The only means we have to limit that air is by keeping that house tight until we're ready to absorb the energy. What does that mean? It means we must ventilate, and in fact, once that fire is put out, we can ventilate as much as we want. The more we ventilate, the better conditions are going to get, but we have to put water on the fire. So the question is, can you get water on the fire, absorb the energy released by the fire before it reacts to the added ventilation? No matter what method you use, and we'll talk a little bit about each method, we want to think about using that method, how that fire is going to respond. Are we going to be able to put water on that fire? Certain methods of ventilation are more effective than other methods, but no matter what method of ventilation you use, you must be able to put water on the fire during that certain period of time. So the question everybody wants to know is, how much time do you have to put water on that fire? We're saying Wait to ventilate until you're ready to put water in the fire, and you have this grace period, but how much time is part of that grace period? What do we mean? It means if you arrive on scene and you break out those windows and you open that front door, there's a certain period of time it's going to take for that fire to react. As soon as you open that door, that fire is not going to instantly react. And there are several variables that go along with that. So how long do we have to put water on that fire? There's a number of variables. What are the variables? Well, we have anywhere between a minute and 30 seconds to 3 minutes between the time we ventilate to when we must put water on that fire, between when those conditions are going to deteriorate, and they deteriorate relatively fast. So what are those variables? Well, the amount of ventilation. What do we mean by that? It means the size and number of ventilations and also the location of those ventilation points. So if you just open the front door, you're going to have more time because the actual ventilation, the fresh air coming to that fire, is relatively small. But if you open that front door and break out every window, you have more ventilation. Clearly the fire is going to respond to that ventilation faster. The size of ventilation openings, the number of openings. The bigger the opening, the location of the opening is going to make a difference. We'll get into that more in a second. The closer the ventilation opening is to the fire, the faster that air is going to get to that fire, the quicker it's going to respond. Also, the size of the structure. A smaller house, there's a lot in Montgomery County. World War II size houses, 1,200, 1,500 square feet. The smaller houses, you have a smaller volume of air. They're going to react faster to the ventilation. If you break out those windows, if you open that door, you're going to have about a minute and 30 seconds. The larger mansion-style houses with the open floor plans, you have a longer time to find that fire. It also will probably take you longer to get to that fire because of the volume of the house. So you have about 3 minutes. So if ventilation is provided, if water is not applied, rapid fire growth needs to be anticipated. What do we mean by that? We read all the time these reports online through the Secret List or Stata or anywhere else that the crews made an aggressive interior attack. They're pushing their way down a hallway, they ventilated, and then all of a sudden there was a rapid, unpredictable increase in temperature. We can no longer afford to say that this is unpredictable. We need to be able to predict that if we ventilate a structure and we're not in a position to put water on the fire, that fire is going to grow. And those conditions inside will always, always, always deteriorate rapidly unless we put water on that fire. So us as engine crews, us as truck crews, us as command officers need to realize once we open that front door, once we break those windows, that is when the clock is starting. We need to anticipate those conditions are going to get worse unless we're able to put water on that fire. So this whole idea that these conditions deteriorated rapidly and they was completely unpredictable is something we need to start anticipating, because it will always happen. If we ventilate a ventilation-limited fire and do not apply water, the conditions will always get worse. So we talked about how our fuels respond to the air we give them faster than ever before. So the question came up and UL evaluated this, and we have a number of videos and tests with ATF that also support this. So once you create that opening, you're allowing fresh air to come in, and the idea is we're going to let that heat out. But what happens in actuality is the fire responds to the ventilation, the fire grows, it releases more smoke, it releases more energy, it overwhelms that opening. So conditions get worse. The temperature increases, the fire spreads, and conditions deteriorate inside. The only way to make that environment better, you can't ventilate enough to make that fire fuel limited. It's always going to be ventilation. It's ventilation limited. It's always going to respond to the ventilation you give it. The only way to improve that environment is by applying water. Once the water is applied, meaning that more energy is absorbed than is released, then the more you ventilate, the faster conditions will improve. So once you actually put water on the fire, you can ventilate all you want, conditions will improve. You must control ventilation up to that point. So we're saying we realize every fire must be ventilated. Why? Not only do you need to access that fire from the outside, inherently you're creating a ventilation opening, but you must find an area to exhaust those hot gases, steam, heat, etc. You must coordinate the vent with a fire attack. What does that mean? Well, there's a number of ways to coordinate it, but what we've seen a lot, especially in cases that we've investigated with ATF, is the engine crew will begin to move in with a charged hand line, and the truck crew will begin to ventilate. They're anticipating that the engine crew is going to put water on that fire, but in actuality, that doesn't happen. There's some sort of delay with the hand line, whether they have a kink in the line, the hose line gets stuck, or something else. So the truck crew begins to ventilate, and there's that delay. So just because we anticipate that they're going to put water on the fire, it does not necessarily mean it's coordinated ventilation. A lot of times that truck crew will enter thinking the engine crew will put water on the fire, and that doesn't happen. So we need to ensure that the engine crew is actually in a position to put water on that fire. When one thing goes wrong, that's when we go beyond this grace period. When that hose line doesn't get charged, now we're pushing that minute and 30, 2-minute, 3-minute window. We assumed ventilation was going to be quickly followed by fire attack. That fire attack doesn't happen. That's when we see the rapid increase in temperatures inside, rapid deterioration of conditions. So as a command officer, as an engine crew, if you know that ventilation is taking place and you're not able to put water on that fire, it's important to let everybody on the fire ground know, because that's when conditions are going to get worse. So we truly have to coordinate when we're truly in a position to put water on that fire. When we're really ready to do that, that's when the ventilation should take place. Typically, it's best to ventilate as close as you can to the seat of the fire, opposite the attack line. What do we mean? When you ventilate close to the seat of the fire, those gases have a shorter route of travel to actually leave the building. And when they're opposite the attack line, it gives that flow path away from the crew for that water, for the steam, those gases and heat, etc., to actually get out of that building. And once that fire is knocked, the more you ventilate, the cooler conditions are going to get using any of the methods. So let's look at the methods. And UL has done the systematic evaluation of horizontal ventilation, of a vertical ventilation, and now they're looking at positive pressure ventilation as well. What we're going to look at today is what are the pros and cons and how they will affect fire growth. Remember, no matter what ventilation method you use, it has to be truly coordinated. Horizontal ventilation. What are the pros of horizontal ventilation? It's relatively quick. What do we mean by that? One person can do it within a short period of time, either from inside or outside of the structure. Because it's relatively quick, it's easy to coordinate, and it's safer. It requires minimal resources. One person can do it. What are the cons? Well, because the opening is in a wall, it's not as efficient as vertical ventilation for the identical opening size. So horizontal ventilation is good because it's easier to coordinate, especially on a 1 or 2 story house. Now we look at vertical ventilation. What are the pros? Well, for the same size opening, it's more efficient than horizontal ventilation. Why? Because we talked about those buoyancy-driven effects. Remember, those openings up high are very efficient. A lot of that hot air is able to rise and actually leave that structure. Because they're very efficient, they allow the hot air out, and cold air can come in. Now, UL has shown that in the modern fire environment, you can't create a hole big enough to actually decrease the temperatures. Because they're very efficient, a lot of fresh air comes in, that fire, the fuel reacts to that added air. Conditions deteriorate. The fire grows with the added air, it overwhelms that vent. Even large vent size, 4 by 4 feet, 4 by 8 foot holes are not enough, and conditions get worse unless you put water on that fire. Now, a lot of times, vertical vent is actually done later in the incident. Why? The crew has to go to the roof, it's relatively labor intensive, and it takes time to cut the hole and actually punch out that actual opening below as well. So a lot of times during that time period, crews are able to put water on the fire. So frequently when we see vertical vent being used, because it takes a long time for it to occur, it usually occurs later on in the fire, and by that point conditions usually improve. So typically we see good effects with vertical ventilation, but a lot of times it's just because it takes a little while to occur. So what are the cons of vertical ventilation? Well, it's relatively more dangerous. Why? Because you're putting a crew of at least 2 people on top of a sloped roof above a working fire using a saw with potentially limited visibility in an IDLH. What are some of the other cons? Well, it requires more resources. It takes a crew of at least 2 people to safely cut a hole. It's also difficult to coordinate. What do we mean by that? Well, before, if you want to call for horizontal ventilation, it takes one person just a few seconds to clear a window. It takes, if you're very efficient, at least a minute or so to cut a hole in the roof. You have to cut the hole itself, then you have to poke through, if you can, and access that area below. It's also difficult to coordinate in terms of a fire attack, meaning that it's difficult to tell how that roof connects to where the fire is below. If you coordinate and actually do horizontal ventilation through a window, that can happen quickly. You can see the fires in that window. You can ventilate it. You know where that fire is. Cutting a hole in the roof is difficult to coordinate, not only in terms of time, but in terms of the location of the fire. As we said before, because that opening is efficient, the fire is going to respond relatively faster as well. Now, we know that the intent is to lower temperatures because we assume that fire is going to go up and out of that hole. However, in all the tests that UL has done, the fire in actuality responds to the increased air, even for very large holes, even by 4 by 8 foot holes. So what are we talking about? We said those fuels respond faster than ever before, so even a large hole above the fire is going to allow a lot of fresh air to come in. That fire responds to the added air and overwhelms that vent relatively fast. Let's talk about using fans on the fire ground as a method of ventilation. No matter how you use a fan, essentially when you turn that fan on, you're accelerating that fire timeline. You're hitting fast forward on that timeline. Why? Because you're pumping a lot of air into the structure. If you're using that fan as a method of attack, essentially that fire is always going to respond to that added air. That fire is always going to grow. Now what NIST has shown is that there is, in certain circumstances, you can improve visibility between that entrance point and where the fire is, and those temperatures can actually decrease. But the fire is always going to grow. Now if that fire grows outside of the structure, it can be a good thing. But if it grows inside of the structure, if it enhances extension, then that can be a bad thing. Now, some of the cons of using a fan is that a positive pressure fan will always cause the fire size to increase. It will always increase the heat release rate of that fire. It can also significantly accelerate fire spread and extension. We did several tests where the fire was actually pushed into the basement. Now, if you know exactly where that fire is and exactly where that fire is going to go, this can be a great tool. But if that fire is still burning, that fire will always respond to the added ventilation. Now, just like any other means of ventilation, if you're able to absorb the energy from that fire and you start a fan, you're going to allow those gases to leave faster. Remember, you're hitting fast forward on that timeline. If the fire is burning, the fire is going to burn and respond even faster to the added ventilation. If that fire is out and you start a fan, then that smoke is going to leave twice as fast. You have to have a very, very good idea of where that fire is and where that fire is going to go to use a fan safely. All the testing that's been done shows that applying water from the interior to the exterior improves fire conditions. Conversely, ventilation without water application will always contribute to fire spread. So there's been a lot of talk about influencing fire spread with water, with hand lines, and we haven't been able to recreate it in any tests. Every test we've looked at, there is absolutely no evidence of influencing fire spread with a hand line. Conversely, every test we've done, we've been able to predictably and repeatedly influence fire spread, make conditions worse by ventilating if we don't apply water. The key to all of this is coordinating ventilation and putting water on the fire as soon as you can. So what are we talking about? Well, we said before that the fire size and location is determined by the amount of ventilation. One of the reasons you can't push fire is because a lot of these fires, as we've talked about, there's no air anywhere else in that room. What do we mean by that? I'm going to show you a video from this fire in a second. Now, we obviously see flames coming out of the window, and what we typically ask is, do you guys think this room is fully involved? Is this room on fire? And the obvious answer, well, of course it's on fire, Adam. I see flames coming out of the window. But in this case, the only place flames exist in this room are over by the window. We've been teaching investigators, we've been teaching firefighters that the entire room is on fire, when in fact, that is not the case in the majority of the fires we run. Why? There's no air anywhere else in this room. There's actually a window right here. You can see there's no flames on the other side of the window. I'm going to show you a camera from inside of this room. The only place where the flame exists is by that ventilation opening. That's key to our fire investigators as well. That means the area where you have ventilation, that's where your strongest patterns are going to be. The heat, the temperature actually decreases as you travel deeper into this room. We're going to go back and look at Baltimore County and show that in areas 10 feet, 15 feet from where Mark died, the temperatures were almost 1,000 degrees less because there was no air. So where the air is where the fire is most intense. If you hit this from the outside, which by the way we will do, and we'll show you the conditions on the inside, the fire goes out. Why? When you do exterior fire attack, you do not make conditions any worse on the inside. Does the fire go out all the way? Absolutely not. You're putting that fire back in time. What do we mean by that? Well, this is a fire that's gone, basically it's at the flashover stage now, it's gone through flashover. The gases released by the fuel inside of the room are what's burning. The seat of the fire is in the middle of the room. As it goes through flashover, those flames leave the seat of the fire and migrate over to the opening. Now, where you had that fire triangle, the only place you had that fire triangle is where that air mixes with that heat, mixes with that fuel. Out here, there's a lot of air. There's no fuel. Inside here, a lot of fuel, no air. So when you flow water in through this window, you're putting water on basically the seat of that fire where you have that fire triangle mixing. As soon as you do that, you absorb a lot of energy. You're putting that fire back in time. People have referred to it as resetting the fire. What do? Well, you flow water, the fire migrates back inside of the room. You decrease the fire size, the amount of energy being released, and now the fire retreats back to where it was burning, probably back to where that fire started. If it was a couch, if it was a mattress, you're going to have a much smaller fire burning inside of that room. If you don't make entry, if you don't put any additional water on that fire, eventually that fire is going to grow back to the same stage again. So we're saying you absolutely have to make entry after you put water on the fire, or else it's not going to go out all the way during an exterior attack. Why? Because you're basically putting that fire back in time. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, it depends on the fire. You flow water in through this window, you knock that fire down, it buys you an extra 3 minutes. You're preventing extension up into that attic, into that solvent area. Let's look at this actual fire. What do? This was an acquired structure that we burned with ATF. It was a mansion in Wisconsin. And we're going to burn 2 different rooms in this house. Both of the rooms are on the 2nd floor. What are we looking at? Well, inside of this room, we have a number of pallets, more than enough fuel to put this room through flashover. But right now, the room is tight. We're going to create ventilation-limited conditions. We want to see what happens when we ventilate. We want to see what happens with that exterior attack. So, in the upper right, we see the actual room that's on fire. The windows are intact, so you see flickers of flame. There are 2 windows here. There's another window on the side. Once that fire becomes ventilation-limited, we're actually going to break that window out. How do we know that fire is ventilation limited? We're taking measurements inside of the structure. We're taking temperature measurements. So once that fire begins to die down, we know that it's running out of air. What I wanted to do in this case was limit the amount of smoke. A lot of cases, if this was a couch on fire, the same fire would produce a lot of smoke. We wouldn't be able to see where the flames are. If we limit that smoke production, we can see where the flames are, and more importantly, where the flames are not. So think of this as being a couch in the middle of the room. We light that couch on fire, we put it out right now. Right now, we know where that fire triangle is, we know where that damage is, we know where that fire started. What do we mean by that? You put this fire out, you're going to see some burning, some clean burning to the drywall above, and you're going to see some burning to the couch. Now, as this transitions through flashover, those flames are going to leave the fuel and migrate over to the window. The room is not completely going to be on fire. It's not going to be completely involved. The only place you have flames are by the window. That's where the fire triangle exists, not where the fire started. So this is a view looking up from the 1st floor, from the kitchen area, to the 2nd floor. This fire is on the 2nd floor. You can see here that smoke layer beginning to drop. Like I said before, and that smoke layer drops to the level of the flames, that fire begins to go out. How do we know that? Temperatures drop. So in this case, that fire began to go out. We vented that window. We noticed the temperatures were dropping. We called for fire department ventilation. You're going to see that the temperatures will now increase. Why? Because we're giving that fire added oxygen. Does it happen instantly? No, it does not. Remember, we have that grace period we were talking about. In this case, it probably takes about 60 seconds. Why? Because we're venting close to the seat of the fire for that fire to respond. So the fire is going to respond to the added air, and we're going to watch it grow. So this screen on the bottom left, you're going to see on the back side, on the opposite side of the room, are the 2 windows. And you're going to see the fire is only going to exist by those windows, not by where the camera is. This is going to be a helmet cam on the guy on the actual line, on the hose line. So we're going to look at 2 different scenarios. One of these scenarios, we're going to hit from the outside. This is typically where I pause it. We look inside, and you see that this room is on fire. From the outside, you see a large volume of fire coming out of the window. You ask an engine officer or anybody else, hey, is this room fully on fire? Is this room fully involved? And they say, well, yeah. You see all the fire coming out. And when in reality, the only reason that flame is coming out of that window is because there's no oxygen on the inside. You look inside of this window, inside of the camera view, the only place you have flames are over by that window. There's no air at all over, at least not enough air for combustion to occur, over by the camera. What does this mean? It means if you flow a hand line in, not only are you putting water on the seat of the fire, not only is that fire going to go out, but you're not going to push fire anywhere because there's no oxygen anywhere else. So as soon as you put water on through the window, you're absorbing a lot of energy. You're putting that fire back in time, 2, 3, 4 minutes. You're resetting that fire. You're buying yourself time because there's no air anywhere else in this room. We're going to come back to this video in a second. Let's look at the second video. the exact same house, the same size room, the same fuel package, but we're going to knock the fire from the outside. So we're going to do what we call a transitional attack in this case. We're going to notice two things. As soon as we put water on the fire size is going to instantly decrease. We're also going to notice we're not going to push fire anywhere else. Why? Because we're absorbing a lot of that energy by putting water on that fire. Will that fire go out completely? Absolutely not. Remember, the goal is to put water on the fire as soon as possible. It improves conditions throughout. Are you going to push fire anywhere? No. And does that fire go out completely? Absolutely not. You still have to make entry and put out that fire completely, but you're putting it back in time. So what are we looking at? The same structure. This time we're on side alpha. That fire begins to become ventilation limited, and we break out the window on side alpha. Now in this case, we actually have fuel located in the hallway. What do we mean by that? I'm going to pause the video for a second. We've lined the hallway with some fuel. Why? Because we want there to be fuel in order to push this fire somewhere else. If this fire is not pushed anywhere, we don't want it to be because there's no fuel there. So we've lined there's the hallway with wood, and on the floor is the carpet, the original carpet. So we ventilate that room, so that fire was becoming ventilation limited. Now now we give it plenty of air. When that happens, the fire responds to it. It starts to grow. You can see in this hallway, we wait until flames are rolling out into the hallway. We want there to be extension into the hallway before we hit it. When we hit it for a few seconds from the outside with a fog nozzle. You can see right there, we put water on the seat of the fire. It instantly goes out. We don't push fire anywhere into that hallway. The temperatures drop throughout. We'll come back to that in a second. Because we open the front door now, we're creating a flow path. We have an opening low. It sucks all of that smoke out of that door into the room and out of the opening we just created. When we get up there, we have a fire that's knee height. You put a little bit of water on it, it goes out very quickly. What do we do by putting water from the outside? You make conditions instantly better on the inside. You're putting that fire back in time. Now let's watch that again. One of the questions we get a lot is the issue of steam. So this fire is continuing to grow. We'll watch it go through flashover. And when we hit it from the outside, there certainly is some mixing. What do we see? We see some steam on the floor level. They say that's going to be bad for victims. Well, no, it's not. The temperatures instantly drop. We're taking temperature measurements inside of the room, in the hallway, and two different locations in the hallway. The same results that you all saw. Why do the temperatures drop? Well, right now, at the floor level, we have rollover coming out of that door. Anybody who's been in rollover conditions know it gets extremely hot. As soon as you put water on that fire, you're taking away the fire, taking away the source of the energy. Right now, we're at almost 400 degrees at the floor level because of that radiation from the rollover above. As soon as you put water on the fire, which we're about to do, you're taking away that flame, taking away the source of the energy, and the temperatures drop. Right there, you can see there's absolutely no fire pushed. The temperatures drop instantly from floor to ceiling. Yes, there is a little bit of steam, but the temperatures drop instantly from about 400 degrees almost down to about 150 degrees at the floor level. They drop throughout the entire structure. Does the fire go out completely? No, it does not. You're putting that fire back in time. Now you have a knee-high fire. You go in, it goes out very quickly. As soon as you stop flowing water, all that steam goes out of the opening that you put the water in through. Conditions begin to get better. In terms of visibility and temperature, conditions get better instantly. So looking at that video, which was a transitional attack, we notice we're not pushing fire anywhere. Now, that's a single video, a single test that we've done. I'll show you two other transitional attacks in a second that we've done at ATF. We show that fire isn't pushed anywhere and conditions improve instantly throughout the entire structure on the inside. We're not saying attack every fire from the outside. Putting water on the fire as soon as possible is key. If that fire is on side Charlie, and it's quicker to go up through that house than it is to go all the way around to side Charlie, absolutely do an interior attack. The key is putting water on the fire as soon as possible. A lot of departments will have their officer, as the officer is doing a 360, if the person on the line is able to flow water inside during that 360, to do that and then go inside. You're putting that fire back in time, just a minute or two. You still have to go inside there and put the fire out, but it's a much smaller fire at that point. Let's go back to the video we started just a few minutes ago. Instead of doing a transitional attack, in this case, we had that fire burning in the area of the opening, and what we're going to do is start a fan. So we talked about how the reason the fire is burning in the area of the opening and not throughout the entire room is because there's not air anywhere through the entire room. The only way we can get that entire room on fire is by starting a fan and pumping in a lot of fresh air. So in this case, we turned on 2 fans at the front door, 2 gas-powered fans. The idea is we're going to positive pressure this house. And when we do that, we increase the fire size. The benefit to positive pressure ventilation is you can, in some situations, improve conditions between the entry point and where that fire is. But you're almost always going to make that fire worse on the inside. So when we talk about that the location and the size of the fire is determined by the amount of ventilation available to it, let's take a look back at Baltimore County. I want to illustrate one more thing. So we saw in the video, this is an overall shot of the building. This is side Alpha, this is side Charlie. Mark was found over by this slider. He was inside of that flow path from the 2nd floor up through that 3rd floor. Now about 10 to 15 feet away from he was this kitchen. Now this kitchen never had air available to it. So as that apartment filled with smoke, it was always outside of that flow path, even though it was about 10 feet from where Mark was. Now looking at the images from this incident, from the kitchen in this case, you can see the cabinets which are open, the chip bags aren't even melted. The conditions inside of this room weren't very severe. Why? There was never any burning occurring inside of this room, never any combustion, because there was never any air available to it. Before the fire could ever get to this room, it was filled with smoke from floor to ceiling. So the fire could never exist. Flames never existed inside of this room because there was never any air. There was never a ventilation opening. Mark was found 10 feet from this room along that ventilation flow path. If you leave that flow path, if you're in those ventilation limited conditions, the fire cannot burn in those conditions. So we see the effects of these flow paths, and more importantly, the effects of these ventilation limited conditions and a lot of the fires we investigate. It was also true in Prince George's County. These back bedrooms where the flow path was bypassed because there was no ventilation, because there was no air back there, the conditions were much more tenable. The temperatures were much lower because there was no air available there. The same thing that UL saw in their tests. When they had a fire and they had rooms with no ventilation openings, the fire remained localized. The fire damage, the severe fire damage where combustion actually occurred, remained localized to where those ventilation openings are. What does that mean to you as a firefighter? It means the more ventilation openings you create when that fire is not under control, that's where the fire is going to go, and it's going to travel there relatively quickly. Why? Because in those bedrooms you have that heat, you have that fuel, but you don't have the air. So if you introduce the air in those other bedrooms, you're giving it that last leg of the fire triangle. So fire is going to spread there. But if there is no air and if you don't ventilate, then those rooms will stay a lot cooler. Why? Because there's no combustion occurring there. Combustion cannot occur because there is no air. We can tell you that putting water on a fire from the outside is not going to make conditions worse. You're not going to push fire, but instead let's show you with actual fire conditions and actual structures. So this next test, we wanted to show the effects of closing that hollow core door. We also wanted to show you the effects of flowing water in from the outside of a structure during a Mayday situation. What do we mean by that? I'll show you in a second. We talked about basement fires in the last lesson. Why they're so dangerous. Why? Well, first reason is there's no reliable indications of collapse. We can't rely on that thermal imager to show us that floor is too hot. We can't rely on floor sag, that spongy feel, to predict when that floor is going to collapse. We can sound the floor with our tools, but we're not sounding the structural members of that floor. So there's no way to predict when it's going to collapse. What else did we determine? Well, in terms of that flow path, in terms of stopping that fire spread by flooding that flow path with our hose lines, it's not effective. You're not cooling the source of the energy, the seat of that fire. The other reason was because that path of flame travel from the basement to the first floor may not always be the stairwell. We talked also about doing an exterior attack on basement fires. That is what we're going to see now. We're going to have a basement fire with rollover above where the cameras are in this case, and we're going to hit it from the outside with a small hand line, and you're going to see conditions improve throughout the entire structure. Let's take a look. This was a garden apartment, and you can see we're going to walk down the stairs, and in this case, this is a helmet camera, and to the right side, we have a fire. The fire is inside of a room. The door to that room is shut. When we open that door, you're going to see the flames are only occurring in the corner of that room. Why? Because that hollow core door prevents ventilation from reaching anywhere else in that room. It only occurs by where we have a small window, basement-sized window in the corner. Once we open that door, we're allowing a lot of fresh air to come in. It takes a few seconds, but that fire responds to that air. Once that fire begins to roll over our heads, we had them hit it from the outside with a small hand line. Exterior attack a 1.5-inch hand line through that window, and you'll see this is a mayday situation. Somebody's trapped in the basement, and hitting it from the outside improves conditions throughout. Why? You're putting water on the seat of the fire. Is it going to go out completely? Absolutely not. Do temperatures drop instantly? Yes, they do. Let's take a look. So we're going to walk down the stairs into the basement of this garden apartment building. To the right is going to be a door. It's a hollow core door. As soon as we open the door, you're going to notice a fire in the corner of the room. The fire's in the back corner. Why? Because there's no air over by that door. This is an exterior shot of that same fire. So I'll pause it for a second. You're going to see, you see a well-developed fire. This is 100% outlet. It's that flow path. Why? It's opening up high. All that fresh air is coming into the door we just opened. The flames exist over by that opening. They're going to start spreading towards the helmet camera, towards where that firefighter is. Why? Because that door was shut. That door would last a long time because there's no air on the other side of it. Once we open that door, we're going to wait for flames to start rolling over the heads of the firefighters. In that case, we're going to hit it from the outside. We are very confident you can't push fire. As soon as the rollover starts to occur, we call for suppression. Right about now, you can see we call for suppression. They hit it from the outside, and we'll watch how much fire is pushed on top. As soon as they hit it, within about 2 seconds, conditions improve instantly. Does that fire go out? Absolutely not. You still have to go in there and put the fire out completely, but do conditions improve relatively fast? Absolutely. This is that mayday situation, almost similar to 57th Avenue in Prince George's County. Applying water from the outside improves conditions throughout. Do you push those flames? No. Why? You're taking away the source of all of that energy. We'll watch it one more time. You can see we have fire in the corner. That fire begins to spread rapidly because we're giving it more ventilation. A ventilation-limited fire. We're not letting the heat out. We're giving it more ventilation. We wait for that fire to begin to roll over our heads, a situation that's quickly going to become untenable even for firefighters in full turnout gear. Once that happens, we call for external application of a water stream. They flow it in through the window. They're putting water on the seat of the fire right there. The fire goes out almost instantly. Does it go out completely? No. Do conditions improve almost instantly? Yes, they do. So that basement fire scenario we just saw was an exterior attack during mayday situations. We get that question a lot. We don't want to push fire on people, but from a command officer standpoint, you see conditions are getting a lot worse from the outside. Do you apply water? And every test that we've looked at and all the data that UL has done, and in that case too, it supports the fact that putting water on the fire as soon as possible from the inside or from the outside improves conditions throughout. UL has been the one, as well as NIST, to systematically evaluate that. They've gotten the federal grant money to look at the firefighting tactics. This is a test that we did with investigators with ATF. We talk about pushing fire in ventilation-limited conditions. This is the worst case they could come up with. What do we mean by that? They said, Adam, we want you to test whether you can push fire from a fully involved garage with the door open from the garage to the house with a fog nozzle applied from the outside and that man door from the garage to the house propped open. I want you to line the hallway with fuel. That's exactly what we did. So in this case, we have a garage fire that's fully involved. We took the entire deck, we piled it up inside of the garage and basically built a bonfire in that garage. We wanted a well-developed fire. We told them to hit it from the outside with a hand line. We're trying to push it into the house. So when we start this video, what are we looking at? This is a camera that's on the floor of the hallway inside of the structure. We have plenty of air. All the windows are broken out. The front door is open. We're watching a fire develop inside of the garage. You can see we line the hallway with fuel. There's a piece of wood. The door, which by the way is required to be a fire-rated door with an automatic closer between the garage and the house, is propped open. It's a metal door. And we wait for the fire to extend down the hallway. So when we're looking into the garage from the house, the garage door, the door you drive through, is actually located on the right side here. So when they hit it, they're going to hit it from outside of the house, and this camera is actually down the hallway around the corner from the access from the hand line. So the hand line is going to come in from the right side of the screen to the left, and you can't hit directly from the hand line where the camera is. So we're waiting for the fire to extend from the garage into the actual hallway. You can see flames begin to extend. We want to wait until the door actually catches fire, wait till these fuels catch fire to see if we can push those flames from the garage with the fog nozzle down this hallway. So we're watching significant fire spread in the hallway. Now we have rollover. If I was doing a search in this case, I'd definitely start to think about getting out of this hallway. Pre-mating situations, pre-flashover conditions. Once those conditions get worse, you can see the fuels are actually igniting, the door is on fire. We hit this fire from the outside with the fog nozzle. We're trying to push it down that hallway. Instantly temperatures drop in the garage. Why? Because we're taking away the fire. Instantly temperatures drop inside of the hallway. Why? Because we're taking away that rollover effect, all that radiation from the rollover conditions. Anybody who's been in those rollover conditions know your gear begins to heat up very fast and conditions are going to deteriorate fast. What do we see? Let's watch this one more time. As soon as we hit that fire, the fire goes out, the main bulk of the fire goes out, as well as the extension down the hallway. Why? The reason you had this burning in the hallway is because the source of the fire, the seat of the fire, is releasing a lot of energy. It's pushing that energy down the hallway. As soon as you take away the source of that energy, the seat of the fire, the rest of the fire goes out. Temperatures drop instantly down the hallway as soon as you put water on the seat of the fire. As soon as you hit it, you take away the source of the energy. When that happens, the fire goes out all the way through. Instantly, the temperature drops. This is especially important for an exterior fire. If you have fire on an exterior deck or from mulch, you need to knock the fire before you go inside, or else you're not taking away the source of all that energy. So we're going to look at one of two more videos that we have left. This is the second to last video, and this is from an actual fire, a fire scene. You're going to see a number of things that we've talked about through the entire video series. The first thing we're going to look at, when they arrive on scene, they have a relatively small fire. They could put it out with probably one hand line, at least certainly knock it down with one hand line, with one crew, with only a few hundred gallons of water. Now in this case, they ventilate and they're not able to put water on the fire. We're going to watch the fire react, and more importantly, you're going to watch that smoke ignite. That smoke is a secondary fuel package, and we're going to see that once we ventilate, it's all going to light off on that entire second floor. We need to recognize that smoke is also a fuel. It's not just the actual physical solid fuels that are burning in a structure fire, it's those gases. And those gases are contained in the smoke. If the smoke is getting warm, it's starting to light off above you, certainly cool it down with your hand line will improve conditions. You must, and we'll see that in this case as well. So you see that there's fire on the basement level and there's smoke coming out of the second floor. Remember we talked about if it's put water on the flames as soon as possible is the best method of fire suppression. If you put water on the fire from the outside, conditions will improve. Right now this is one hand line, a one crew type of fire with tank water probably. Now as the firefighter arrives on scene, you'll see, I'll show this again, before the hose line is ready, he decides to ventilate. I'm sure what he's thinking is we're going to let the smoke out, let the heat out. There's a lot of heat and smoke on these upper floors because you have all those gases built up. They're all trying to leave the structure. When that happens, when you ventilate, you create a large outlet. When you create a large outlet, you're allowing more air to flow in. Now the same thing would happen if you cut a hole in the roof. What does that do? It creates a bigger outlet. You have more air flowing in through the inlet. You have less resistance through the building. Once you ventilate, does that fire respond instantly? No, it takes several seconds for that fire to react, but conditions certainly get worse. Why? Because instead of letting the heat out, you're letting more air in. The fire responds to the air inside of the structure, conditions begin to get worse. You don't have a big enough opening to allow all those byproducts to come out, so the fire responds. What do we see now? At a minute into the video, you see that smoke ignite. Remember that smoke is a secondary fuel, and rapid horizontal ventilation in this case would be deadly for any crew on the inside. We break out all the windows, we're trying to let the heat out, and in turn we make the fire much worse. This fire is ventilation limited. It started out with one crew, one hand line, went to maybe two crews, two hand lines. Now you have the basement level involved, an entire section of the first floor involved as well. With the intention of letting that heat out, letting the smoke out, now we have a very severe fire. We'll watch it one more time from the very beginning so we can tie all these concepts together. We arrive on scene, one crew, one hand line. We can see that flow path develop. We see an inlet and we see an outlet. Remember, if we keep this house tight, we're going to limit the size of the fire. We want to wait to ventilate until we're ready to put water on that fire. Truly coordinate that ventilation. Is it okay to hit this fire from the outside? Absolutely it is. We've shown through our tests, through UL's systematic evaluation, that conditions get better when you put water on the fire from the inside or from the outside. If we wait to ventilate, that fire will remain in check. Instead, we ventilate without putting water on the fire. with the intentions of letting the heat out, with conditions of letting the smoke out to improve visibility, what happens? It doesn't happen instantly. If you just broke one window, it would take longer. Instead, all the windows are broken, so we have more ventilation. That fire responds even quicker. This is that grace period we're talking about. We could still put water in the fire now, and conditions would get better. We don't put any water in the fire responds to the ventilation we give it. Our fuels behave differently than they used to. Now we have what was a small fire to then second floor being almost fully involved. We're talking about more water required, more hand lines, more crews, more resources, and more importantly, in this case, we showed that the rapid horizontal ventilation would have been fatal for any crew on the inside. You're not improving conditions. There was no oxygen available to that first floor until we ventilated. We had heat and we had fuel. Now we had that oxygen. Now we have combustion. The temperatures increase the more that we ventilate. So the last and final video we're going to show you is what we call the tabletop model. And this uses actual fire to show all the concepts we've talked about. We're going to see firsthand ventilation limited fires. We're going to see where that fire is, even more importantly, where that fire is not. We're going to look at the ventilation limited basement fire conditions, the same fires that killed the guys in DC and San Francisco. You're going to watch that fire flow develop. And instead of using a compartment with 4 sides, we take away one side and make that side out of glass. So you can see where the fire is not. And you can look at all these concepts together. Now, I built this tabletop model to teach our certified fire investigators what's going on inside of a structure when it's on fire. And it's directly related to Baltimore County, but it illustrates all these concepts with actual fire. So before we start the video, let's go over what we're looking at here. This is the scaled compartment model, and we're looking at 3 different boxes, and these boxes are connected. So the front side is glass, fireplace glass, and it can take the heat generated from the fire. So typically when we would just see a wall, now we're actually going to be able to see what's happening inside of the compartment. Now, when fire burns, it's actually the vapors released from the fuel that burns. It's not the solid or liquid fuel. In this case, we're going to use alcohol, so we're not going to have that smoke obscuring our vision. It's going to burn the same, but we're taking that smoke out of the equation, so we're going to see where the flames are. So here's a compartment. In this first model, it's going to be kind of the basement compartment. When it comes to Baltimore County, it's going to be that terrace level apartment. We have an opening on the left side and an opening on the right side. This is going to simulate the stairwell. We can open and close these doors remotely. And this is going to be the second floor. So these compartments are connected by doors. Right now, all those doors are closed except for one opening on this side. Let's watch those flows develop. So when we light this fire, we have that bidirectional flow. Remember, the fuel is going to stay the same throughout this entire time. The only thing we're going to change is ventilation. It's just like an actual compartment fire. So we see once we create this opening, we have that bidirectional flow. So this first section is meant to show what happened in Baltimore County. You can see that as we change the size of the opening, almost instantly the fire size changes. The fuel stays the same. We're only changing the ventilation going to that fire. When that opening is small, the volume of the fire is small. In the upper right of this bottom compartment, we have plenty of fuel and no air. The bottom left, we have plenty of air and no fuel. Where that mixes is where you have that fire triangle. We can see when I limit that opening, this is what happens in a compartment fire. The fuel is in these pans. There's no air over by those pans. When we limit the opening, the flames actually leave the fuel and migrate over to the opening. If you hit this from the outside, you can't push fire anywhere in this compartment. Why? There's no air. That fire wants to exist throughout the entire compartment, but where there's no air, there can't be combustion. So as we limit that opening, we actually remove the flames from the fuel back over to where that ventilation opening is. There's tons of fuel in here and no air. Outside of the structure, there's tons of air and no fuel. Where that comes together is where you have that fire triangle. That's where you have your flaming region. As you make that opening bigger, we think we're going to let the smoke out, let the heat out. Well, no, the fire responds to it. And repeatedly, as you make that opening smaller again, we're limiting the size of that fire. Unless you have a means to put water on that fire, you don't want to ventilate because that fire is going to respond. You can see we pull that flame away again by limiting the opening. The only thing we're changing this entire time is the amount of ventilation. Ventilation is key. As you make that opening bigger, now we have that bidirectional flow. It's inherently inefficient, so the fire doesn't involve the entire structure. We have more volume of fire, but it's not as bad as it's going to be when we get that unidirectional flow path. We ventilate, the fire gets worse. We're not letting the heat out. We're letting more air in. It overwhelms those openings, the exhaust gases do. So now we have two openings at the same height. This is simulating the Baltimore County example, and that changes as soon as the fire department arrives, makes that opening on side alpha. Now we have that unidirectional flow path, one opening low and one opening high. This is not a wind-driven fire. This is not due to the effects of a fan. This is only because we have two openings at different heights, something that happens in almost every fire we run. So now we have a lot more fire. Why? Because we have a very efficient flow. We have air coming in low, mixing with the flames coming all the way through, and it's exhausting out high. We flow CO2 in and trying to battle that flow path, and we're not making any progress on the seat of the fire. All those gases are blown away. Conversely, if you flow CO2 in from side Charlie in through the inlet, it entrains that CO2, or if you use a hand line, that steam, all that conversion gases, all the way through, and the fire goes out all the way through. Using that flow path to your advantage is key. If you try to fight it, your gear is going to heat up very quickly. Your hand line's not going to do a lot of work. You're going to have poor visibility. If you use it to your advantage, you're going to have direct access to the seat of the fire, and you're going to be able to use that flow path to your advantage. All those gases, the suppression gases, are going to follow that flow path. Conditions are going to improve. Let's look at it one more time. So we're going to ignite the fire from the outside. Again, now we just have that bidirectional flow. It's relatively inefficient. The fuel stays the same throughout this entire demonstration. As soon as we open that door, watch that flow path change. That's the fire department arriving on scene. You'll watch the volume of fire increase. Why? We're venting up high. It's an efficient opening. We're letting more air in. The fire size does not decrease. In the stairwell, we have absolutely no fuel. All that fuel is coming in from the apartment that's on fire. This is why your hand line doesn't have an impact on that fire, because nothing in the stairwell is actually burning. The vapors are burning, and those vapors are coming from the floor below that's on fire. That was the Baltimore County flow path. Now let's look at how that flow path existed in Cherry Road and in San Francisco. So we're going to ignite a fire in this next case, and when we do that, we're going to have a relatively tight basement. The only ventilation available to this fire is that bidirectional flow coming from the opening, in this case on side alpha. So we're going to block the opening on the Charlie side of the building. In that case, you have a smaller volume of fire because you have that bidirectional flow, and you're able to make the stairs. Why? Because you have only one opening at the front side, and it's remote. The fire is remote from that opening. The fire is relatively small. You also have that bidirectional flow, meaning that the air coming down the stairs is keeping you cool if you get down low. So the amount of ventilation is decreased, and you also have that bidirectional flow allowing you to get into that stairwell. So they're making entry, and whether the fire department breaks the window or whether it actually ventilates itself, you can see conditions change, and they change quickly. In this case, if you're in the stairwell, that flow path changes from bidirectional to unidirectional. So even if you get down low, very, very high temperatures, and the size of the fire increases rapidly. So imagine yourself in the stairwell right about now. That bidirectional flow is keeping you cool. And essentially you have zero visibility. Whether you see actually flames or not, as soon as you move the actual opening, you remove the opening, now conditions change, and they change fast. No matter how low you get, conditions are very, very high. When you try to exit through the same way you came in, you're following that flow path. In this case, we actually see flames. The evidence shows in a lot of the conditions that by the time you get along that flow path, you're missing the air. So you have those high temperatures, but you don't recognize you're in a bad spot until your gear becomes saturated, until you start to get burned. So in that case, the flow path changes as they're making entry through that building, because you have that added ventilation. So you have that unidirectional flow path developed, not only because the fire department broke out the window, or if the fire actually vented itself. So that was the basement fire scenario, the same scenario that killed the firefighters in San Francisco and on Cherry Road. Now we're going to look at the second flow path that existed in Baltimore County. What do we mean by that? Well, before we had this simulating the terrace level and the stairway going up. Now this is the middle level, the second floor. This is still the stairwell, and this is the third level. In that case, in the actual case, we had a couch inside of the doorway that caught fire. Now we're going to have a pan of fuel inside of the doorway, and we're going to see if that fire is going to extend, even though there's no fuel in that stairwell, from this middle level to the top floor. This is the same flow path that trapped Mark inside of the apartment above. So we have that fire burning below. In this case, remember that couch caught fire inside of the stairwell, inside of the slider, and when the crews did their search, they left both doors open. It created that flow path all the way through. Now, originally, that flow path was from the the back side to the front side. Well, in this case, the other opening is all the way through the building. But because the opening on side Charlie in the third level is above the opening on the second level, it has a higher height, that develops a flow path all the way through. So you can see once we open that door, now we have that same flow path. All that energy is trapped in the stairwell. It travels all the way through. It ignites what we call the target fuel at the top of the stairs. Everything that we're seeing in the actual evidence from the scene, everything we're seeing from the fire model, a computer model, we can validate with this actual fire flow path. Now, what's going on here? By the time the fire gets to the back of the apartment, we run out of air. So we have lots of heat, lots of smoke, lots of exhaust, but we don't have a lot of flame because there's no air left by the time we get through there. So incredibly high heat, but we don't always see flame conditions. If this was an actual solid fuel burning, you'd see a lot of smoke pouring out of this side. So we have more flames. We have high volume of flame in the stairwells, even though there's no fuel. All that fuel is coming down below, and it's traveling all the way through the building only because this opening is higher than this opening. If we flow CO2 in from the inlet, remember using that flow path to your advantage, the fire goes out all the way through. So you can see if you try to fight that flow path, the fire will keep flashing back over and over again. See, it flashes there. But if you use that flow path to your advantage, in this case we'll flow CO2 in, the fire is going to go out all the way through. So in this case, the flow path existed from side Charlie back to side Charlie. And then on side Alpha, you had no evidence of the flames until it was too late, until that flow path already extended to the to the third floor. Other thing we're looking at, compartmentation. We validated it from the scene. We validated the effects of compartmentation from the computer model, but we also see it in the scale model. If that door remains shut, then we're blocking that flow path. The flames never exist. So if the third floor door stays shut and we open the second floor door, the flames never extend to that apartment above. The same thing happens if we close the second floor door and open the third floor door. The fire remains isolated to that second floor. We've known this for a long time. That's why these door closers are required, but in this case, they did not function. By keeping that door shut, all those flames stay inside of the apartment. So if either one of these doors were shut, conditions would be completely different. You're blocking that flow path, you're creating ventilation-limited conditions, you're compartmentalizing yourself, you're compartmentalizing the building, and the fire doesn't spread all the way through. So when we did this exact same presentation for the Secret Service in Baltimore County, where Mark Falkenham worked, they asked us a bunch of questions. One of the questions was, what would the effect of vertical ventilation been in the stairwell for Mark if he was trapped on the third floor? Now, what they were thinking, and the knee-jerk reaction is to think if you let that energy out of the top of the stairwell, then conditions will improve. It may not extend to that third floor ever because all that heat is going to travel out of that opening. So let's go to the model. What are we going to do? We're putting a large size hole, a 5 foot by 5 foot hole, in the perfect spot, right? And when perfect spot, I mean right where that heat and smoke impact that ceiling. And it's going to occur, it's open right now before flashover occurs. So the thinking is they're going to let some of the heat out. Some of that heat is going to actually go into the attic instead of going to that third floor. The prior research has shown that the more we ventilate, if we don't put water on that fire is going to react to the added ventilation. So we're going to get a higher volume of fire. So what happens in this case? Well, the answer is both of those things happen. Some of that energy is split. So some of that energy goes into the attic, and some of it still goes to that third level. Because we have two outlets now, we have more air flowing through the inlet. Now we have an inlet here, an inlet coming up the stairs, but we also have an outlet here and an outlet here. So we have a larger volume of fire. So the question is, does it slow down flashover? Yes, it slows flashover by about 4 to 5 seconds. But is it the ultimate solution? The answer is definitely not. We have a larger volume of fire because we have more air flowing up those stairs and through that apartment. So some of that energy is split into the attic, some of that energy is split into the actual room, and it still certainly goes to flashover. Does it buy a few seconds? It does, because that energy is divided between the attic and that apartment, but there's more energy being released. So basically all that energy is being split, but there's a larger sum of energy. If you close that door, any of those doors, then conditions would always be tenable inside of that apartment. All the models suggest that. So is vertical vent the solution? It may have bought some more time, but in this case, it certainly would have prevented flashover completely because we're providing ventilation limited fire, more ventilation without putting water on it. We were able to show, using the FDS model, the computer model, that venting the stairwell may have delayed flashover, but the overall volume of fire increased because we're ventilating a fire more without putting water on it. Let's look at that same scenario in the actual scale model with real fire. Now, the conditions aren't identical to the actual model, but we'll see that the volume of fire increases when we vertically ventilate. Remember, the idea is we're going to let the heat and smoke out, but in actuality, we're letting more air in without absorbing the energy. When we allow more air in, you can see the volume of fire increases. It would take a little bit longer in real life, but in this case, you can see the overall volume of fire increases. The idea that we're letting the heat and smoke out isn't what happens in actuality, isn't what happens in reality. So as part of this video series, we tried to rapidly summarize the modern fire research that has been done by UL, by NIST, and some things by ATF as well. We started out talking about ventilation flow paths. And remember, ventilation flow paths occur in every fire. Now, if that flow path changes a unidirectional, basically the exhaust path of that fire from floor to ceiling, you're putting yourself in a bad spot if you're in that flow path. Our hose lines do little to actually fight that flow path and combat that flow path, and it's something that can cause your gear to heat up very quickly. A lot of times, it's what we see here. It's a lot of smoke and no fire, so if you're in that atmosphere, you don't realize you're in a bad situation because you don't see flames. And that energy can travel through your gear and you don't realize it until it hits you. Your gear becomes saturated with that heat and no longer protects you well. We talk about these flows occurring in every fire. It's that buoyancy-driven flow, and when that happens, that hot air wants to travel up and out, and the cold air comes in behind it. We need to recognize these flow paths. In a lot of these line of duty death reports, we talk about fire dynamics, and we give firefighters an overview of fire dynamics and essentials of firefighting, and then never again. And that's the intent of this three-part series, is to review the modern research that's been done on fire dynamics. We need to reconsider our tactics because our gear has changed, our fire environment has changed, and our knowledge, the science behind firefighting, has also changed. So we need to be able to recognize when these flow paths develop. In terms of ventilation flow paths, if you enter through that lowest point, through the inlet, that's the safest place. Your water is going to do the most work. You're going to have the coldest air coming in behind you to keep you cool and better visibility. So as part of the second phase of this video series, we talked about ventilation flow paths and a number of firefighters who have died at incidents as part of being involved in these ventilation flow paths. The first thing that has failed as part of their PPE was their face pieces. Throughout the years, the actual clothing PPE has gotten a lot better. It's been able to absorb a lot more energy to protect us. We need to recognize the capabilities and the limitations of our PPE in terms of being saturated with energy, but also in terms of our face pieces. Looking at these line of duty deaths and several others, NIOSH was able to figure out that a number of these firefighters, the first part of their PPE to fail, the weakest link was their face pieces. The new face pieces we are going to get are going to become more durable. Have they hit the field yet? Not in many places. And until that happens, we need to realize, we need to identify the signs of failure. First of all, that crazing, and then that bubbling of the face piece before it fails. And at that point, we certainly need to get out. So in the third phase of the video series, we talked a lot about tactics, ventilation tactics and suppression tactics. Now, an important measure you can take is actually compartmentalizing yourself from that fire, shutting that door based on our actual real fire tests, as well as UL and NIST tests. It'll buy you at least 5 minutes. You're blocking that flow path, you're limiting the available oxygen to that fire, you're buying yourself time. Now in this third series, we've basically reviewed two important simple facts. The first one is when it comes to ventilation, no matter what method you use, it needs to be coordinated with the fire tech and truly coordinated. Wait to be done until water is ready to be flown onto that fire. Now, when that happens, it doesn't matter what method you use, horizontal, vertical, or a fan, if that fire is out, conditions will improve rapidly. Now, if that fire is not out, if you're not able to absorb that energy, the fire will get worse. The part of the fire triangle that's missing, the majority of fires that we run by the time we get on scene, is that air. If we introduce that air without putting water on the fire, conditions will get worse. Our fuels respond differently. That heat is going to increase. We need to think about ventilation before we do it. We need to limit that air until we're ready to limit the heat release from that fire with a hose line. We are no longer venting to let heat out. We're no longer venting to let smoke out unless we're ready to put water on that fire. I want to take the time to thank Gladys Falkenhand for letting us share the information from the Baltimore County line of duty death and coming out here to speak as part of the video series, as well as Chief Steve Lohr for inviting the ATF Fire Research Laboratory to make the video and working with Montgomery County. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.